Abraham Lincoln is often considered to be the greatest American president, but most people don't know he was responsible for one of the worst massacres in American history. Before the monument, there was the man, a rail splitter from the American frontier who rose to become the savior and, at times, the destroyer of the Union. Abraham Lincoln's story is not a solitary page in the patriotic annals of American history. It is a story of sacrifice, of struggle, of shattered illusions, and a nation on fire. In the chill of a Kentucky winter, on February 12, 1809, a child was born in a modest one-room log cabin in what was then known as Hardin County, Kentucky. Abraham Lincoln entered the world not with pomp, prestige, or promise, but with poverty clinging to his cradle. The son of Thomas and Nancy Lincoln, Abraham grew up knowing the hunger and uncertainty of the ragged edge of the American frontier. As a farmer, his father believed hard work was the truest measure of a man, perhaps a necessary outlook at a time where frontier farming was as much about taming the land as it was about cultivating it. During young Abe's childhood, his father would move their family from state to state in search of work, before eventually settling them in Indiana in 1816. But this early age of America was a ruthless and unforgiving predecessor to the America of today, and Abraham's mother ended up passing away from sickness when he was only 9 years old. This left young Abe in the care of his steely, unbending father and his grieving sister Sarah, who herself was only 11. His mother's passing was a sorrow he would carry for life, going on to immortalize her kindness with his infamous quote, "All that I am or hope to be, I owe to my angel mother." Just as he was marked by the grief of childhood loss, so too was he shaped by the wild, ungoverned land where he was raised. He once described himself as a piece of floating driftwood, never staying long in one place. Frontier families couldn't manage long without a wife and mother, and so Abraham's father soon remarried. Sarah Bush Johnston was a kind and literate woman, a silver lining for the young Abraham, who possessed an insatiable thirst for reading. It was a trait Sarah nurtured, encouraging Abraham's love of books by going so far as to gift or lend him books of her own. But Thomas himself remained a stern, stubborn figure, a man of the plow, not the pen. Some sources claimed he saw little value in books, and scorned Abraham's preference for reading over manual labor. Their natures grinded against one another like stone on stone, deteriorating their relationship and creating a strain that would last until the end. To Abe's disadvantage, formal education was nearly non-existent in the wilds of the early 19th century Indiana. And, combined with his father's harsh and unyielding insistence that Lincoln work to help support the family, this meant Abraham Lincoln received fewer than 12 months of schooling during his youth. But the boy was unshakably ravenous for knowledge. He read everything he could find. Having devoured all that his stepmother had to offer, he borrowed books from neighbors and walked for miles at a time just to get his hands on volumes of Shakespeare, Pilgrim's Progress, and Aesop's Fables. By the flickering light of the hearth, after long days of chopping wood or working the fields, Lincoln devoured words like they were nourishment. In them, he found a path beyond the muddy edges of his world. In 1830, at the age of 21, Lincoln and his family uprooted once more, this time to Illinois, fleeing an outbreak of disease that echoed the illness that had claimed his mother. With the move, Lincoln found the opportunity to put some distance between himself and his father, and to separate himself from the rigid expectations of frontier life. Now a young man, Lincoln could have been described physically as awkward, even gangly, standing at 6 feet 4 inches tall and often wearing clothes that didn't quite fit his lanky frame. But he was also magnetic. Friends said he could hold a crowd with a single story or joke. During the 1830s, while settling himself in Illinois, Lincoln struggled to find himself and his purpose, now that he was divorced from the expectations of his father. He worked as a shopkeeper, a postmaster, a laborer. He studied surveying and eventually set his sights on practicing law. But, in the end, it was politics that began to stir the fire within him. In 1832, he volunteered to fight in the Black Hawk War. Though he saw no combat, he was elected captain of his militia unit, a role he later said gave him more satisfaction than any other. When some of his men threatened to kill a Native American who had approached their camp in peace, Lincoln stood in their way and refused them, saying, "This must not be done." Even as a young man, his sense of justice was unshakable. After the war, Lincoln found himself rerouting his ambitions towards political involvement. He ran for state legislature and lost. But undeterred, he tried again in 1834, and this time, he won. Unfortunately, his first seat was short-lived, ending after only a single term. Yet, unbeknownst to anyone at the time, it was the beginning of Honest Abe's long, winding climb into the national consciousness. Having lost his seat, Lincoln returned to practicing law. By 1839, Lincoln had moved to Springfield, Illinois, where he began making a name for himself as a successful lawyer. It was here that he met Mary Todd, a well-educated and ambitious woman from a prominent Kentucky family. Their courtship, though full of the flutter and excitement of romance, was fraught with tension and interruption, including a broken engagement courtesy of Mary's disapproving family. So deep was Abraham's grief at the loss of the relationship that his friends quietly feared he would do himself harm. But in the end, the lovers persevered, and in 1842, they married. Unfortunately, the turbulence of their courtship would be mirrored in their marriage, a union marked by deep affection and a tempest of unending grief. Together, Mary and Abraham would welcome 4 sons into the world, but only one, Robert, would live to adulthood. The deaths of their children plunged Mary into sorrow and Lincoln into despair. The man so often seen as stoic was, in private, tormented by depression. The loss of their sons would, in time, cause the affection of their marriage to wither. After 16 years of working as a lawyer, Lincoln found himself gravitating back towards politics. He served a single term in Congress from 1847 to 1849, during which he stood firmly against the Mexican-American War, denouncing President James K. Polk's expansionist ambitions as a thinly veiled land grab. It was an unpopular position, especially amongst those intoxicated by the dream of manifest destiny. As a result, Lincoln, principled but politically isolated, returned once more to Illinois, a failed congressman drifting into obscurity. But history tends to act like a tide, pulling back from the shores of relevance only to surge forward. In 1854, a political earthquake shook the nation. The Kansas-Nebraska Act. Drafted by Senator Stephen A. Douglas, the bill shattered the fragile peace established by the Missouri Compromise. It allowed settlers in Western territories to determine for themselves whether slavery would be permitted, a doctrine known as popular sovereignty. To Lincoln, this was not democracy. It was moral collapse. He called it conceived in violence, passed in violence, sustained in violence. Driven by outrage and his uncompromising morals, Lincoln re-entered the public sphere. He set aside the quiet lawyer from Springfield and transformed himself into a thunderous bulwark standing against the expansion of slavery. Over the next several years, he delivered more than 100 speeches, traveling from town halls to dusty county fairgrounds, building a reputation not just as a skilled orator, but as a man of conscience. Over time, Lincoln's political home, the Whig Party, dissolved into irrelevance, and several of its members abandoned the sinking ship to join the newly formed Republican Party. Lincoln hesitated to join this fledgling coalition, which had been stitched together from abolitionists, former Whigs, and Free Soil Democrats. It was diverse, unstable, and untested, but Lincoln was ultimately a pragmatist, and he understood the winds of history were blowing in a new direction. By 1856, he had joined their ranks, certain that the moral battle over slavery would soon engulf the nation. In 1858, he challenged his old adversary Stephen Douglas for a U.S. Senate seat. What followed became legend: the Lincoln-Douglas debates. 7 meetings spread across Illinois, where the two men battled not just for votes, but for the soul of the country. In one defining moment, Lincoln warned, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." It was a bold prophecy, and one that would ring truer than Lincoln himself could ever know. Despite all efforts, Douglas won the election. But Lincoln was far from defeated. Though he had lost the election, in his place, he had gained national attention. Newspapers across the North began to whisper an idea that would soon thunder across the land: Lincoln for president. In response to the rumblings, Lincoln quietly admitted to his close companions that if he were offered the presidential nomination, he would accept. In his heart, however, he felt far more uncertain of his successes. Nevertheless, propelling himself ever forward, in February 1860, Lincoln arrived in New York City. Here on the East Coast, Lincoln had none of his hard-won Illinois renown to precede him. In this corner of young America, he was little more than a lanky oddity, a political curiosity. But when he took the stage at Cooper Union, the atmosphere shifted. His speech was masterful, logical, yielding no quarter and making no concessions. He argued that the Founding Fathers had intended slavery to die out, not expand. When he left the podium, he was no longer simply a novel voice from the West. He was a legitimate contender for the highest office in the land. The speech earned him not only the respect of the public, but that of his political cohorts. The Republican presidential nomination soon followed. The following election of 1860 became a defining moment in American history. Lincoln's name did not even appear on the ballot in 10 southern states, yet he won the presidency with just under 40% of the popular vote, a win carried by a deeply divided North. The South interpreted his victory not just as a political loss, but as a potential death knell. Between December and February, 7 states declared their intent to secede from the United States: South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. Lincoln had not even taken office yet. Amidst the political division, his inauguration was overshadowed by fear. Rumors of assassination circled like a dark omen blowing in from the South. His train route to Washington was altered. In Baltimore, a known hotbed of secessionist sentiment, he donned a soft felt cap instead of his iconic stovepipe hat, hoping to slip through the city unnoticed. Critics mocked him as paranoid, or even as cowardly. They did not yet understand the scale of the storm that awaited him on the horizon. With the tumult his victory had given rise to, Lincoln entered the presidency with a single, unwavering goal: to preserve the Union. Truly believing that America wouldn't fall to civil war, he attempted to broker a peace with the Confederacy. However, Lincoln was resolute in one area he was unwilling to compromise on: the spread of slavery. As tensions continued to build, it became increasingly clear that this divided house was about to fall. When Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter on April 12, 1861, the war officially began. At his heart, Lincoln was a man driven by mercy and compassion. He had refused to be the one to throw the first stone. But he was also a leader, a man bound by a rare and unflinching sense of duty. And now that the two sides had come to blows, he spared no response. He called for 75,000 volunteers. The Union rallied, and 4 more states, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, joined the Confederacy. The war tested Lincoln beyond imagination. He suspended habeas corpus, authorized the arrest and detainment of 15,000 civilians without trial, and expanded presidential power in ways never before seen. His opponents accused him of tyranny, and doubt took up a seat even at the table of his allies. But through it all, Lincoln remained steadfast, profoundly haunted by the weight of each decision, but driven by a moral clarity few around him could match. On January 1st, 1863, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. Wrapped in the complexities of legal loopholes Lincoln had become a master of, the Emancipation Proclamation allowed the Union to confiscate slaves as property, obtained under the conditions of war. Though antithetical to Lincoln's own moral views, this phrasing allowed him to liberate the slaves in all 10 seceded states, and to declare it an objective of the Union to free captive slaves in Confederate territories. It was not a complete solution, but it redefined the war. No longer was it merely a struggle for unity. it became a crusade for human liberty. Black men, once forbidden from bearing arms, were welcomed into the Union Army. In one swift stroke of the pen, Confederate manpower and economy were decimated, while the Union's numbers were bolstered. Over 180,000 would fight. Many would die. All would alter the future of America. In November of that same year, on the blood-soaked fields of Gettysburg, Lincoln delivered a brief address, just 270 words long. Yet those words, spoken at the dedication of a cemetery, have echoed through the annals of history. 77 years ago. The Gettysburg Address remains one of the most defining articulations of American ideals: equality, democracy, and sacrifice. By 1864, with the conflict still raging fiercely, Lincoln was facing a new and great dilemma. His presidential term was nearly over. The war dragged on, and the death toll was staggering. The Civil War was an ever-growing bloody stain that soaked and permeated the cloth of his presidential legacy. Even Lincoln himself truly believed he would lose re-election. He quietly drafted a note to his cabinet, promising to cooperate with his successor to preserve the Union in his final months. He asked them to sign it without reading it. But then came Sherman's capture of Atlanta. Union victories in the Shenandoah Valley. At the turning of the tide, public sentiment shifted in Lincoln's favor. He triumphed over General George McClellan in the election, securing 212 electoral votes. In his second inaugural address, he offered no victory lap. Instead, his message for the nation was one of mercy, with malice toward none, with charity for all. Before Lincoln could turn to the task of reconciliation, however, there was one last, monumental step he knew had to be taken: the 13th Amendment. Though the war was still raging, the president was resolute. Slavery, the festering wound at the heart of the nation's conflict, could not remain part of the Union's future, regardless of the war's outcome. He understood that the Emancipation Proclamation was a powerful symbol, but it was an executive order, temporary and contingent on the war's success. What he needed was permanence. In a strategic and decisive move, Lincoln pushed for the passage of the 13th Amendment in the winter of 1864, before the end of the war and the consolidation of political shifts brought about from the most recent election. He knew full well the political risk it posed. The battle to secure enough votes in the House of Representatives was brutal, filled with backroom deals, persuasion, and at times, raw political maneuvering. Lincoln was no stranger to compromise, but in this case, his commitment to a lasting end to slavery transcended the ordinary measures of politics. For him, it was not just about the war. It was about the soul of the nation. He fought to ensure that the amendment would pass, even if it meant swaying reluctant lawmakers with promises of patronage, or persuading holdouts with moral appeals that tugged at their consciences. On January 31st, 1865, after weeks of relentless political maneuvering, the 13th Amendment passed the House of Representatives, securing the legal end of slavery in the United States. 2/3 of the vote was required to succeed. The outcome was a narrow win of 119 in favor to 56 against. But it was a win. Lincoln's lifelong moral crusade against the blight of slavery had finally been turned into a constitutional reality. And yet, even in this historic moment, he lingered not on celebration, but on what would come next: the healing of a shattered nation. The Civil War ended on April 9th, 1865. General Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox. Lincoln immediately began planning a gentle reconstruction, one that would reunite the nation without vengeance. Having steered the ship of his country successfully through such turbulent waters, his dream was one of rebuilding and healing, not punishment or humiliation. But for all he had endured, and all he had sacrificed, fate allowed him only 5 days of peace. During this time, Lincoln made an address where he declared his consideration of granting voting rights to some Black American men. Unbeknownst to him, a Confederate spy and sympathizer was amongst the huddled masses of his audience. His name was John Wilkes Booth. Booth was a passionate and beloved actor, rising on the theater stages of America. He was also a diehard Confederate, with an obsessive, untempered hatred for Lincoln. On April 14th, Lincoln and his wife Mary attended a play at Ford's Theater. Their guest of honor, General Grant, had declined, opting instead to visit family in New Jersey. Unbeknownst to him, this choice would save his life. That evening, Booth, a familiar face to theater staff with unquestioned access to the building, slipped into Lincoln's private box. At 10:15 p.m., he fired a single shot into the president's skull. Lincoln died the following morning, April 15th, 1865. Booth fled for 12 days and over 90 miles before dying at the hands of Union soldiers. The country was paralyzed with grief. As Lincoln's funeral train wound its way through cities and towns on the long journey back to Springfield, thousands lined the tracks in silent mourning. On May 4th, Lincoln was laid to rest. But although Booth had succeeded in killing the man, his legacy and values would prove to be immortal. He would be remembered as the great emancipator, as the man who held the Union together through its most terrible trial. And yet, for all of Lincoln's greatness, his legacy bears a shadow. In 1862, 1 year before issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln authorized the largest mass execution in American history. The Dakota War, also known as the Sioux Uprising, had erupted in Minnesota following broken treaties, government neglect, and starvation amongst the Dakota people. In the brutal fighting that followed, over 490 white settlers were killed. In the aftermath, military tribunals hastily sentenced 303 Dakota men to death. Lincoln, troubled by the scale, ordered a review. He personally examined the charges and commuted the sentences of 265 men. But 38 remained. On December 26, 1862, in the town of Mankato, Minnesota, all 38 men were hanged in the largest mass execution in the U.S.'s young history. The event was a calculated compromise, Lincoln bowing to immense political pressure amidst the Civil War, while attempting to impose the restraint and fairness that defined his character. Some would see it as an act of mercy, others of judgment. It also stands in stark contrast to Lincoln's later treatment of Confederate leaders. Despite the deaths of over 400,000 Union soldiers, not a single Confederate general was executed by Lincoln's order. This was the complexity of Abraham Lincoln, immortalized as a hero, but ultimately, only a man. He walked a knife's edge between democracy and tyranny, between mercy and necessity. He fought for the soul of a fractured republic, leaving behind a legacy both flawed and enduring. He did not live to see America rebuilt, but in death, he became its conscience. And perhaps that is where his power still lies. Not in perfection, but in the imperfect pursuit of a just world.
Thanks for watching History Exposé. If you love uncovering the best stories in history, hit like and subscribe to keep exploring with us. Don't forget to visit our main page, Factinate, for more incredible facts about everything.